In this video, we're diving into an international energy drama that has the potential to reshape the global landscape: Canada's threat to cut off electricity and oil exports to the United States. What does this mean for U.S. energy markets, trade relations, and even your daily life? Stick around as we break down how this situation could set the stage for massive political shifts, price surges, and ripple effects across multiple industries. Let's buckle up and break down this intense trade standoff. Section 1. Canada's bold electricity cut threat. Let's start with the first and most immediate shockwave coming from our neighbors to the north. Canada is threatening to cut off electricity exports to the United States, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Now, many of you might not realize it, but certain U.S. states rely heavily on Canadian electricity imports to meet their energy demands. For example, New York, Michigan, and Minnesota depend on Canada for up to 95% of their electricity imports. In fact, according to a report from the U.S. Department of Energy, DOE, the U.S. imported approximately 20.000 gigawatt-hours, GWH, of electricity from Canada in 2024, primarily through interconnections with the Canadian provinces of Quebec, Ontario, and Manitoba. This is not a small issue. This represents a massive portion of their energy supply. And the consequences of cutting off this crucial flow of power could be devastating. Picture this. A sudden shutdown of electricity imports would leave millions of people without reliable power, especially during peak demand periods. We're talking about higher energy bills for households, and at worst, blackouts or grid failures. The U.S. government would scramble to find alternative energy sources, but that could take time. And it may be too late to avoid significant economic damage. A 2024 report by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, NERC, highlighted how interdependent the North American energy grid is, warning that such disruptions could lead to localized grid failures in several regions. But here's the twist. Canada is using energy as a bargaining chip. This move is part of a broader strategy to respond to U.S. tariffs and trade policies that have been hitting Canada hard. By threatening to restrict this vital electricity supply, Canada is sending a clear message to U.S. policymakers: you can't take us for granted. This is a high-stakes game of political power, where energy is the leverage that Canada holds. As energy prices surge and grid instability sets in, U.S. policymakers may have no choice but to reassess energy policies and possibly shift trade negotiations with Canada. This could be the spark for a much broader rethinking of North American trade relations, one where energy exports become just as important as the goods and services exchange. Section 2. Oil as a political leverage. But this story doesn't stop at electricity. Canada's oil exports to the U.S. are another major area where tensions are heating up. Right now, the U.S. imports around 6.1 million barrels of oil per day. And guess what? Roughly 52% of that comes from Canada. Pipelines like Keystone XL and Enbridge form the backbone of the U.S. oil supply, with Keystone XL alone having the capacity to transport 830.000 barrels of oil per day from Canada to U.S. refineries. Source: U.S. Energy Information Administration, 2020. For the U.S., this steady supply of affordable Canadian oil is a key component of its energy security. Canada is the U.S.'s largest foreign oil supplier, which makes the potential disruption of this flow extremely impactful. But there's a growing crisis on the horizon. Canada has been hinting at the possibility of cutting back on oil exports in retaliation for rising U.S. tariffs. If Canada were to reduce or even suspend these oil exports, the U.S. would face a massive energy crisis. Gasoline prices would shoot up, and industries that depend on oil, like manufacturing, transportation, and even agriculture, would find themselves scrambling for more expensive alternatives. Even a temporary disruption could send shockwaves throughout the global oil market, pushing up prices not just in North America, but worldwide. The U.S. economy could experience everything from higher fuel costs to soaring manufacturing expenses. And in turn, consumer prices would rise. All of this could compound the growing trade tensions between the U.S. and Canada, leading to a volatile energy market with potentially lasting consequences. The U.S. Energy Information Administration, EIA, reported in 2020 that even a temporary disruption in Canadian oil imports could push gasoline prices up by 10 to 15%, potentially increasing operating costs for industries and affecting the price of everyday consumer goods. Section 3. The escalating trade war. Now, let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. This is not just about electricity or oil. This is part of a much larger trade conflict between the US and Canada. The US trade war with Canada has been escalating for years, fueled by the America First policies that seek to prioritize domestic production over international trade. The US has already imposed sweeping tariffs on goods like steel, aluminum, and consumer products, creating a lot of tension with its neighbor to the north. In response, Canada has retaliated, imposing its own tariffs and proposing restrictions on key exports like oil, electricity, and rare earth metals, all of which are crucial to the US economy. In fact, Canada is home to one of the largest reserves of rare earth elements like lithium, cobalt, and nickel, which are essential for the production of electric vehicles and advanced electronics. If Canada were to restrict these exports, it could disrupt the green tech sector and the automotive industry, especially as the world transitions to electric vehicles. And this is where things get interesting. Canada's export restrictions aren't just about economics, they are also about political power. By holding back critical resources like oil, electricity, and metal, Canada is using its position as an energy powerhouse to influence US decision-making. This ongoing trade war has far-reaching implications. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, estimated that global trade conflicts could cost the global economy up to $7.4 trillion in global economic output. These figures underscore just how significant the broader economic impact could be if the US-Canada trade war continues to escalate. The big question here is, how far will both countries go in these tariff battles? If these tensions continue to escalate, the effects will extend well beyond trade and into the very fabric of the North American economy. In the automotive industry alone, higher production costs, delays in supply chains, and price hikes could all come into play. Section 4. Interwoven economies and the hidden risks. Let's explore something crucial here: the interwoven economies of the US and Canada. These two nations are tightly connected through energy trade and the flow of raw materials. It's not just about oil and electricity, it's also about vital minerals like lithium, nickel, and cobalt, which are critical for the automotive industry and the tech sector. According to the US Trade Representative, trade between the two countries was valued at $762.1 billion in 2024, making Canada the US's largest trading partner. Energy exports alone make up a significant portion of this trade, with Canada supplying 60% of US crude oil imports. Consider this: Canada's energy products are worth billions of dollars to the US economy. In 2024, the US was importing billions of dollars in Canadian energy products. Underscoring the importance of this relationship, American industries simply cannot function without these imports. For example, automotive manufacturing relies heavily on Canadian raw materials and energy to keep production lines running smoothly. But there's a catch: this deep interdependence also creates vulnerabilities. If the political situation takes a turn for the worse and Canada decides to restrict exports, the US economy could face severe disruptions. Manufacturing costs would rise, which would translate into higher consumer prices. Global competitiveness could be lost if production costs rise too much, making North American products less attractive on the world stage. This complex economic relationship makes the current trade dispute even more precarious. A disruption in the flow of energy or materials could trigger widespread price hikes, delays, and even inflation, all of which would impact consumers in both countries. Section 5. The domino effect of trade disruptions. But here's the kicker: these trade disruptions have a domino effect. It's not just the energy sector that's impacted, it's every sector that relies on raw materials and energy. Let's break it down. The automotive industry, for instance, is heavily dependent on Canadian crude oil to keep its operations running smoothly. If the US can't get the oil it needs from Canada, automakers would be forced to seek out more expensive sources. This would result in higher manufacturing costs, which would be passed on to consumers in the form of higher vehicle prices. And it doesn't stop there. Tariffs on steel and aluminum could drive up the cost of car parts, making them more expensive to produce. This would lead to higher prices for everything from cars to consumer electronics, things we all use daily. The supply chain disruptions could also delay product availability, which would be felt across industries, further straining the economy. Section 6. Ripple effects across other industries. While we've mainly focused on the automotive industry, the implications of these energy disruptions and trade wars extend far beyond just cars and trucks. These tensions will reverberate through multiple industries, impacting everything from agriculture to consumer goods to high-tech manufacturing. Let's take a closer look at how these disruptions could affect some of these sectors. Agriculture, the fuel for growth. First up, let's talk about agriculture. Many U.S. farmers and agricultural producers rely heavily on affordable fuel for their operations, with Canada's oil playing a critical role in U.S. energy supply. Any significant disruption could lead to higher fuel prices, which would trickle down to farmers. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, estimates that fuel costs make up roughly 5 to 10% of the total operating costs for many large-scale farms. If fuel prices surge due to reduced Canadian oil exports, it could lead to increased costs for fertilizers, equipment operation, and transportation of goods from farms to markets. The end result? Higher prices for food, which would directly affect consumers. This is not a hypothetical scenario. Food inflation has been a growing concern in the U.S., with the Bureau of Labor Statistics reporting that grocery prices rose by 2.9% in 2024. In particular, livestock farmers and grain producers who rely on energy-intensive processes might find themselves squeezed by these rising costs, ultimately passing those higher prices on to consumers. Technology and electronics, the impact on manufacturing costs. Next, let's consider the technology sector, which is deeply tied to both rare earth metals and energy resources. Canada is a significant supplier of critical minerals like lithium, nickel, and cobalt, all of which are essential for smartphones, electric vehicles, and laptop computers. According to a report by Natural Resources Canada, Canada holds approximately 10% of the world's cobalt reserves. These minerals are crucial for the production of high-performance batteries, and disruptions to Canada's export supply could increase prices for these materials, making tech products more expensive to manufacture. The consumer electronics industry could feel the pinch. Manufacturers of devices like smartphones, tablets, and laptops would face rising costs for the raw materials needed to make their products. This could lead to higher prices for consumers, especially as demand for tech products continues to grow globally. In 2024, global smartphone sales were estimated at 1.22 billion units according to Canalys report. And any price increases due to material shortages could have a significant economic impact. Additionally, the transition to renewable energy technologies, which relies heavily on the same minerals, could slow down, hindering the growth of green tech solutions. In fact, many solar panels, wind turbines, and electric vehicle batteries depend on Canadian-sourced minerals, so any export restrictions could stifle the clean energy movement. Energy-dependent sectors, from manufacturing to transportation. Let's talk about energy-dependent industries. Think about transportation, logistics, and manufacturing. These industries rely on a steady supply of affordable energy, especially oil and electricity. If Canada cuts off oil exports, or if energy prices surge due to grid instability in the U.S., companies in sectors like shipping, airlines, and construction could see their operational costs skyrocket. A spike in gasoline or diesel prices would likely lead to increased shipping costs, which would then be passed on to consumers. Similarly, the airline industry relies heavily on oil for its jet fuel. If fuel prices rise due to Canadian oil export restrictions, ticket prices would likely follow suit, and passenger travel could decrease, especially for budget-conscious travelers. Construction also suffers from rising energy prices. The National Association of Home Builders, NAHB, reported that energy costs represent about 7 to 10% of the overall cost of construction projects, including both residential and commercial buildings. If electricity prices rise or if there are disruptions in the supply of materials from energy-dependent sectors, the construction industry might face delays or higher prices for projects, further driving up housing costs. Section 7. Energy geopolitics and political economy. Before we wrap up and talk about the real-world consequences, let's take a moment to dive into some theoretical concepts that help explain why energy exports and trade wars have such profound effects on global economies. One theory that's highly relevant here is energy geopolitics, which looks at the way countries use their energy resources as a form of political leverage. Essentially, energy isn't just about supply and demand, it's also about power. Countries with substantial energy resources, like Canada, can influence political outcomes by controlling access to that energy. This is often referred to as resource diplomacy, where energy becomes a tool for shaping international relations and securing national interests. In the case of Canada and the US, Canada is in a unique position because it is not just an energy supplier, it's also a key ally of the US when you throw in the dynamics of tariff wars. We see that these resource-based political moves become far more complex. While both countries are highly interconnected economically, their political goals sometimes diverge, leading to trade conflicts. Let's also consider the theory of comparative advantage, which is an essential concept in international trade. According to this theory, countries should specialize in producing goods and services that they can produce more efficiently than others. For example, Canada's comparative advantage lies in the production of natural resources like oil and electricity, while the US excels in technology and advanced manufacturing. By engaging in trade, both countries benefit, but when protectionist policies like tariffs come into play, the benefits of comparative advantage can be disrupted. Instead of specializing, countries might focus on producing more of the same goods, leading to inefficiencies and higher costs. In this specific context, the theory of political economy also plays a role. The political economy examines how governments interact with markets and how political decisions influence economic outcomes. When Canada decides to use its oil and electricity exports as a bargaining chip, it's an example of political economy in action. It's not just about economics, it's about how political decisions, such as tariffs or trade restrictions, ripple through the economic system, causing market distortions and affecting consumer behavior. Lastly, there's the idea of energy security, which ties into national security. Countries that are dependent on energy imports can find themselves in vulnerable positions. By threatening to cut off energy exports, a country like Canada can hold significant leverage over its neighbor. Energy security has become a top priority for many nations, and when this balance is disrupted, it can have serious repercussions not only on trade but also on national stability. These theoretical frameworks help us understand the larger forces at play in the conflict between Canada and the US when we think about energy trade disruptions. It's not just about the immediate effects like higher gas prices or blackouts. It's about the long-term consequences of political power struggles and how they shape both economic relationships and global security. Conclusion. So, after breaking down the practical impacts, trade theories, and global dynamics, what can we expect from this ongoing drama between Canada and the US? The current trade conflict underscores just how deeply energy politics is intertwined with global economic systems. As we've seen, Canada's energy exports are not just a commodity, they are a strategic asset. By leveraging its energy resources, Canada is challenging US policies, forcing a reassessment of how the two countries engage in trade and diplomacy. This type of situation is not unique to North America. In fact, it's an example of a growing trend where countries are using natural resources as tools for political negotiation on the global stage. The effects of energy supply disruptions could send ripples through industries beyond just the energy sector. Automotive manufacturers, tech companies, and even households could all feel the impact in the form of higher costs, inflation, and even economic slowdown. The theoretical frameworks we've discussed, from energy geopolitics to comparative advantage, help explain why these shifts are not just short-term hiccups but could signal a long-term reshaping of how nations handle trade and diplomacy. In the end, these tensions remind us of how vulnerable we are in an interconnected global economy. A disruption in energy trade can affect everything from fuel prices to manufacturing costs to consumer prices. And ultimately, the overall stability of national economies. If anything, this episode between the US and Canada shows us that the next big trade war might not just be over steel and aluminum, it could very well be over energy. As this situation unfolds, we'll have to keep a close eye on how political decisions continue to impact both nations and the world. The future of energy trade may very well depend on how well countries can balance the demands of domestic production, global trade, and political power.